Chapter 17. Once the jurors had taken their seats and the courtroom was quiet and all eyes were on Judge Gantry, he said, "Mr. Nance, I believe you have one more witness." Clifford Nance stood straight and important, and said with drama, "Your Honor, the defense calls Mr. Peter Duffy himself." The tension was suddenly thick as the defendant made his way to the witness chair. Finally, after 4 long days of trial, the accused would take the stand and tell his side of the story. But in doing so, he would also subject himself to questions from the prosecution. Theo knew that in 65% of murder cases, the defendant does not testify, and he knew the reasons why. First, they are usually guilty of the murder and cannot withstand a clever and nasty cross-examination from the prosecution. Second, they usually have a record of prior criminal activity, and once on the witness stand, the record becomes fair game. In every trial, a judge tries to explain to the jury that the defendant does not have to testify and does not have to say a word nor produce any witnesses on his behalf. The burden is on the state to prove him guilty. Theo also knew that the jurors are very suspicious of a defendant who will not testify to save his own neck. If they were suspicious of Pete Duffy, Theo could not tell. They watched him closely, and he settled into the witness chair, raised his hand, and swore to tell the truth. Theo could see it all because, thanks to Judge Gantry, he was sitting in a ringside seat in the second row behind the defense, with Ike to his right and his father to his left. His mother had appointments back at the office. She says he couldn't waste the afternoon sitting through a trial, though it was obvious to the other 3 Boones that she really wanted to. Clifford Nance cleared his throat and asked the defendant to state his name, a necessary but rather silly thing to do under the circumstances. Everyone in the courtroom not only knew Pete Duffy, but also knew a lot about him. Mr. Nance then began a series of simple questions. He took his time establishing the basics. Mr. Duffy's family history, education, jobs, businesses, lack of criminal record, and so on. The two had spent hours rehearsing all this, and the witness settled into a routine. He often glanced over the jurors in an effort to establish an easy conversational tone. "Trust me," he seems to be trying to say. He is a nice-looking man in a stylish suit, and this struck Theo as a little odd, because none of the 5 male jurors wore a coat or tie. Theo had read articles about the strategy of what lawyers and their clients should wear during a trial. The back and forth finally got around to something important when Mr. Nance brought up the subject of the $1 million insurance policy on the life of Mrs. Myra Duffy. The witness explained that he was a firm believer in life insurance, that when he was a young man with a young wife and young children, he had always saved his money and invested in life insurance, both for himself and for his wife. Life policies are valuable tools to protect the family in the event of an untimely death. Later, when he married his second wife, Myra, he had insisted on purchasing life insurance, and Myra agreed. In fact, the $1 million policies had actually been in her idea. She wanted the protection in case something happened to him. Though he seemed unable to completely relax, Mr. Duffy was believable. The jurors listened carefully. So did Theo, and more than once he reminded himself that he was watching the biggest trial in Strattenberg's history. Plus, he was also skipping school with an excuse. From the life insurance, Mr. Nance moved the conversation to Mr. Duffy's business adventures, and here the witness scored well. He admitted that some of his real estate deals had gone sour, that some of the banks were squeezing him, and that he had lost a few partners and made some mistakes. His humility was touching and well received by the jurors. It made him even more believable. He strongly denied that he was even remotely close to bankruptcy and rattled off an impressive series of steps he was taking to unload debt and save his assets. Some of it was over Theo's head, and he suspected a few of the jurors were slightly confused too. It didn't matter. Clifford Nance and his client thoroughly prepared. Under the state's theory, the motive for the killing was money and greed. This theory was looking weaker and weaker. Mr. Ness then moved to the delicate matter of the Duffys' marital troubles, and here again the witness did a fine job. He admitted things had been rocky. Yes, they had gone to marriage counselors. Yes, they had consulted separate divorce lawyers. Yes, there had been fights, but none violent. And yes, he had moved out on one occasion, a miserable 1 month period that made him even more determined to patch things up. At the time he was killed, they were together and happy and making plans for the future. Another whack at the prosecution's theory. As the afternoon wore on, Clifford Ness steered the testimony to the subject of golf, and they spent a lot of time. Too much time, in Theo's humble opinion. Mr. Duffy was adamant in his assertions that he had always preferred to play golf alone, and they had been doing so for decades. Mr. Ness produced a file and explained to the judge that it contained his client's scorecards that dated back 20 years. He handed one to the witness, who identified it. It was from a golf course in California 14 years earlier. He had shot an 81, 9 over par. He played alone. One scorecard followed another, and the testimony soon became a tour of golf courses all over the United States. Pete Duffy played a lot of golf. He was serious. He kept his records, and he played alone. He went on to explain that he also played with friends, played for business, even played with his son every chance he got. But he preferred to play alone on an empty course. When the tour was over, there seemed little doubt that another of the prosecution's theories had been shot down. The notion that Pete Duffy had been planning the murder for 2 years and that he began playing golf alone so he could pull it off with no witnesses around seemed unlikely. Theo kept thinking, there are 4 people in this crowded courtroom who know the truth. Me, Ike, my dad, and Pete Duffy. We know he killed his wife. I kept thinking, this guy is about to walk and there's nothing we can do. It's the perfect crime. Boone kept thinking, how can we find the mysterious witness and bring him in before it's too late? The last scorecard was from the day of the murder. Mr. Duffy had played 18 holes, shot 6 over par, and played alone. Of course, the scorecard had been kept by him, so its accuracy could be questioned. Theo had already learned that, in golf, most scorecards reflect something other than actual numbers of strokes. Mr. Nance became much more somber when he questioned his client about the day of the murder, and his client responded well. Mr. Duffy's voice grew quieter, sort of scratchy and pained, as he talked about his wife's brutal death. I wonder if he's going to cry, Theo asking himself, though he was moved by the testimony. Pete Duffy held the tears and did a superb job of describing the horror of hearing the news, racing home in his golf court, and finding the police there. His wife's body had not been moved, and when he saw her, he collapsed and had to be assisted by a detective. Later, he was seen by a doctor and was given some medication. What a liar, Theo thought. What a phony. You killed your wife. There's a witness. I have your gloves hidden in the office. Pete Duffy talked about the nightmare of calling her family, his family, their friends, and planning and enduring the funeral and burial. The loneliness, the emptiness of living in the same house where his dear wife had been murdered. The thoughts of selling it and moving away. The daily trips to the cemetery. Then the horror of being suspected, accused, indicted, arrested, and put on trial. How could anyone suspect him in the murder of a woman he loved and adored? He finally broke down. He struggled to control himself and wiped his eyes and repeatedly said, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. It was very moving, and Theo watched the faces of the jurors. Total sympathy and belief. Duffy was trying to save his life, but it was working. As his client tried to regain his composure, Clifford Nance decided that they scored enough. He announced, "No more questions, Your Honor. We tender the witness." Mr. Jack Hogan stood immediately and said, "May I suggest a short recess, Your Honor?" A recess would break the action, take the jurors away from the emotional testimony they had just heard, and it was just after 3:30. Everyone needed a break. 15 minutes, Judge Gantry said. Then we'll start the cross-examination. 15 minutes dragged into 30. He's running out the clock, Ike said. It's Friday afternoon. Everyone's tired. He'll send a jury home and come back Monday. I don't know, said Woodspoon. He might want the final arguments this afternoon. They were huddled in the hallway near the soft drink machines. Other little groups of spectators were waiting, watching the clocks on the wall. Omar Cheap appeared and needed something to drink. He put some coins in a machine and made a selection while glancing at the Boones, then retrieved the can from the dispenser. I kept talking. Hogan won't touch him. He's too slick. The jury will find him not guilty in less than an hour, Wood said. He's walking, Theo added. I really needed to get back to the office, Wood said. So do I, Ike added. Typical Boones. Neither made a move because both wanted to see the end of the trial. Theo was just glad they were together and having a discussion, a rarity. There was a movement down the hall, and the crowd began to shuffle towards the courtroom. A few had left during the recess. It was, after all, Friday afternoon. When they were inside and seated again and quiet, Judge Gantry assumed his position on the bench and nodded at Jack Hogan. It was time for the cross-examination, and when a defendant was on the stand and the prosecutor had the right to question him aggressively, the result was usually pretty ugly. Jack Hogan walked to the witness stand and handed Pete Duffy a document. Recognize this, Mr. Duffy? Hogan asked, suspicion dripping from every syllable. Duffy took his time, looked it over, front and back, for several pages. Yes, he finally said. Please tell the jury what it is. It's a foreclosure notice. On which property? Rick's Road Shopping Center. Here in Strattonburg? Yes. And the Rick's Road Shopping Center is owned by you? Yes, me and a partner. And the bank sent you that foreclosure notice in September of last year because you were behind in the quarterly payments on the mortgage. Is that correct? That's what the bank said. Do you disagree, Mr. Duffy? Are you telling this jury that you were not behind in the mortgage payments on this property in September of last year? Jack Hogan waved more of the papers as he asked this, as if he had plenty of proof. Duffy paused, then offered a fake grin. Yes, we were behind in payments. And the bank had loaned you how much money on this property? $200,000. $200,000, Hogan repeated as he looked at the jurors. Then he walked to the table, put down one handful of papers, and picked up another. He situated himself behind the podium and said, Now, Mr. Duffy, did you own the warehouse on Wolf Street in the industrial park here in Strattonburg? Yes, sir. I had 2 partners in that deal. And you sold the warehouse, didn't you? Yes, we sold it. And the sale took place in last September, right? If you say so, I'm sure you have the paperwork. Indeed, I do. And my paperwork shows that the warehouse was on the market for over a year, that the asking price was $600,000. The mortgage at State Bank was $550, and that you and your partners finally sold it for just over $400,000. Hogan was sort of thrusting the paperwork in the air as he spoke. You agree, Mr. Duffy? That sounds about right. So you lost a chunk of money on that deal, right, Mr. Duffy? It was not one of my better deals. Were you desperate to sell the warehouse? No. Did you need the cash, Mr. Duffy? The witness shifted in weight and seemed a bit uncomfortable. We, my partners and I, needed to sell the warehouse For the next 20 minutes, Hogan hammered away at Pete Duffy and his partners in their financial woes. Duffy refused to admit that he had been desperate, but as the cross-examination grew stressful, it became obvious that the witness had been scrambling to prop up one deal while the other fell through. Hogan had plenty of paperwork. He produced copies of 2 lawsuits that had been filed against Pete Duffy by ex-partners. He grilled the witness about the allegations of the lawsuit. Duffy adamantly denied he was at fault and explained that neither case had merit. He freely admitted that his business had been struggling, but clung to the position that he had been far from bankruptcy. Jack Hogan did a masterful job of portraying Duffy as a cash-starved wheeler dealer who barely managed to stay one step ahead of his creditors, but linking his problems to the motive for a murder was still a stretch. Changing subjects, Hogan began to position himself for another bomb. He politely poked around the issue of the Duffys' troubled marriage, and after a few easy questions, asked, "Now, Mr. Duffy, you testified you actually moved out. Is that correct?" "It is. And this separation lasted for 1 month." "I wouldn't call it a separation. We never referred to it as that." "Then what is it called?" "We didn't bother to give it a name, sir." "Fair enough. When did you move out?" "I didn't keep a journal, but it was July of last year. Roughly 3 months before a murder, something like that." "Where did you live after you moved out?" I'm not sure I actually moved, sir. I just took some clothes and left." "Okay, and where did you go?" "I spent a few nights at the Marriott, just down the street. I spent a few nights with one of my partners. He's divorced and lives alone. It was a pretty lousy month." "So you were just here and there for about a month." "That's right." "Then you moved back home, patched things up with Miss Duffy, and were in the process of living happily ever after when she was murdered. Is that the question?" "Strike it. Here's the question for you, Mr. Duffy." Jack Hogan was back with paperwork. He handed a document to the witness, and with one glance, Pete Duffy became pale. "Recognize that, Mr. Duffy?" "Oh, I'm not sure," Miss Duffy said, flipping a page, trying to stall. "Well, allow me to help. That's a 4-page lease for an apartment over in Weeksburg, 30 miles away. The lease is for a nice 2-bedroom furnished apartment in a swanky building, $200 a month. $2,000 a month. Ring a bell, Mr. Duffy?" "Not really. A 1-year lease beginning last June." Duffy shrugged as if he had no clue. "It's not signed by me." "No, but by your secretary, Miss Judith Mays, a woman who lived with her husband at the same address here in Strattonburg for the past 20 years. Right, Mr. Duffy?" "If you say so. She's my secretary." "Why would she sign a lease for such an apartment?" "I have no idea. Maybe you should ask her." "Mr. Duffy, do you really want me to call her as a witness?" Sure, go ahead." "Have you ever seen this apartment, Mr. Duffy?" Duffy was rattled and dazed and clinging to a slippery slope. He glanced at the jury box, offered another fake smile, and then replied, "Yes, I've stayed there a couple times." "Alone?" Hogan barked with perfect timing and great suspicion. "Of course I was alone. I was over there on business. Things ran late, so I stayed in the apartment." "How convenient. Who's paying the rent?" "I don't know. You'll have to ask Miss Mays." "So you're telling the jury, Mr. Duffy, that you did not lease this apartment and you're not paying the rent?" "That's correct." "And you've only stayed there a couple times?" "That's correct." "And the leasing of this apartment had nothing to do with the problems you and Miss Duffy were having?" "No. Again, I didn't lease the apartment." To Theo, who knew the truth, Pete Duffy's honesty had been severely questioned. It seemed obvious that he was lying about the apartment, and if he told one lie, then he would certainly tell another. Evidently, Jack Hogan had no way to prove how often Duffy had used the apartment. He moved on to the subject of golf, and his cross-examination lost its steam. Duffy knew much more about golf than the prosecutor, and the two haggled and bickered for what seemed like an hour. It was almost 6 p.m. when Jack Hogan finally sat down. Judge Gantry wasted no time before announcing, I have decided not to hold court tomorrow. I think the jurors need a break. I hope you have a quiet and restful weekend, and I'll see you here at 9 Monday morning. At that time, we will have closing arguments, and you'll finally get the case. Again, the usual instructions. Do not discuss this case. If anyone contacts you and attempts to discuss this case, please notify me immediately. Thank you for your service. I'll see you Monday. The bailiffs escorted the jurors through a side door. Once they were gone, Judge Gantry looked at the lawyers and said, Gentlemen, anything more? Jack Hogan stood and said, Nothing at this time, Your Honor. Clifford Nance stood and shook his head no. Very well. This court is adjourned until 9 Monday morning. And that's the end of chapter 17.